Julian Davenport had built his entire life around control. Every decision, every investment, every meticulously calculated move had shaped him into the man he was today. Ruthless, successful, untouchable. Power wasn't just something he had. It was something he mastered. But all of that shattered in an instant. She was standing in the lobby of the Celeste Grand Hotel, her silhouette illuminated by the golden glow of the chandeliers. Sienna Carter, his ex-wife. And clinging to her hand, half hidden behind the folds of her sundress, was a little girl. A little girl with his eyes. Julian's body went rigid, his grip tightening around the crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. The warm liquid burned down his throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire now raging in his chest. Impossible. The child, her child, was the right age. 3, maybe 4. The same deep blue eyes. The same unmistakable sharpness in her small, delicate features. His pulse pounded. Had Sienna kept this from him all these years? Had he unknowingly passed his own daughter on the street, oblivious to the truth? Julian was not a man who dwelled on the past. He thrived on moving forward, never looking back, never second-guessing his choices. When his marriage had ended, he had buried himself in work, in deals, in building an empire too vast to be shaken by something as trivial as love. To the outside world, he had everything. A multi-million-dollar business, global influence, the kind of power that made men bow when he entered a room. And yet, sitting in the luxurious lounge of one of the most exclusive resorts in the country, he felt something he couldn't quite explain. Something unsettling, something foreign. A weight in his chest, exhaustion, maybe, or something else. He took another slow sip of whiskey, letting the hum of distant conversation blur around him, and then he saw her. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The woman who stepped through the revolving doors moved with the same quiet grace that had once captivated him. Sienna. Her dark brown hair spilled over her shoulders, tousled from the ocean breeze. She adjusted the child's tiny backpack, her fingers brushing gently against the little girl's back as she whispered something in her ear. Julian's stomach clenched. 3 years. It had been 3 years since their divorce. 3 years since she walked away without a single demand, leaving behind only a signed contract and an empty closet where her things used to be. Their separation had been clean, calculated, devoid of emotion, or at least that's what he had forced himself to believe. He had convinced himself she was a mistake, a distraction, one he had erased with work, power, and the cold comfort of absolute control. But now, staring at her standing just feet away, he felt anything but in control. And as his gaze drifted back to the little girl beside her, a realization slammed into him like a freight train. Had Sienna been carrying his child when she left? Julian exhaled sharply, his entire world tilting beneath him. This wasn't just an unexpected encounter. This was a reckoning. Julian had spent years convincing himself that he had left the past exactly where it belonged, behind him. But now, staring at Sienna and the little girl at her side, something cold and unfamiliar twisted in his gut. The child looked too young for her to have been born long after Sienna walked away, and yet too old for him to ignore the sinking feeling gnawing at his insides. A wave of dread settled deep in his stomach. Was she Sienna's daughter? And if so, was she his? Julian watched as Sienna spoke briefly to the receptionist, shifting the child in her arms as she adjusted the bag over her shoulder. He barely registered the quiet murmur of voices around him, the faint jazz playing over the resort's speakers, nothing more than white noise in the background. All he could focus on was the undeniable familiarity of the little girl's face, the way her small hands clutched Sienna's dress, the slight furrow of her brows when she looked around, the sharpness of her delicate features. A part of him knew, even before he could fully accept it, he needed to talk to her. He needed answers. But before he could move, before he could force his body to stand, Sienna was already walking toward the elevators. She held the little girl close, cradling her as the doors slid shut. And just like that, she was gone. Julian remained frozen, staring at the empty space where she had stood, his entire body wound so tight it felt like he might snap. For the first time in his life, the carefully constructed order of his world felt uncertain. That night, he barely slept. No matter how much he tried to shove the image of Sienna and the child from his mind, it refused to leave. An unrelenting force demanding his attention. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, locking away his emotions in favor of logic, discipline, and cold, calculated decisions. But tonight his mind was a battleground of questions. Was the little girl Sienna's? That much was obvious. The way she clung to her mother, the protectiveness in Sienna's every movement, there was no doubt. But the real question, the one he wasn't sure he was ready to face, was whether she was his. The thought sent an unfamiliar panic through him. A panic he didn't know how to process. If Sienna had given birth to his child, why had she never told him? Had she truly believed he didn't deserve to know? Or worse, had she thought he wouldn't care? By the time the first light of dawn spilled through the penthouse windows of his suite, Julian had made a decision. He wasn't going to waste another second on speculation. He needed answers, and he was going to get them. After a quick shower and changing into a tailored navy suit, because, no matter the situation, he refused to be anything less than in control, Julian headed downstairs. Sienna hadn't left. He knew it. This wasn't the kind of resort someone stayed in for just a single night. He made his way toward the restaurant, scanning the elegant dining space. The resort catered to the kind of people who could vacation in the middle of the week without a second thought. But he wasn't looking for them. He was looking for her. And then he found her. A small table near the terrace. Sienna sat with the child beside her, stirring a cup of tea, her posture calm but alert, like she was trying to blend in, but still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The little girl. Lena. Julian vaguely remembered the name the receptionist had said the night before. She swung her legs under the chair, taking small, slow bites of toast, her little fingers wrapped around a cup of juice. And for the first time, Julian got a good look at her. The sight made his stomach tighten. Her blue eyes, his blue eyes. There was no denying it now. Taking a steadying breath, Julian stepped forward. Sienna noticed him before he even spoke. Her entire body went rigid. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her teacup. She knew exactly why he was here, and she was terrified. So she should be, because he wasn't walking away this time, not without the truth. Sienna's grip tightened around her coffee cup, her fingers clenching the ceramic like it was the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Her gaze flickered toward Lena, her daughter, their daughter, before snapping back to Julian, her expression carefully unreadable. "We need to talk." Julian's voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Sienna hesitated, her breath uneven. She looked at Lena again, brushing a gentle hand over the little girl's curls before finally nodding. "Not here," she murmured. "Meet me outside in 15 minutes." Julian gave a curt nod and turned away without another word, his movements sharp and deliberate. He refused to make a scene, not here, not in front of their daughter. But inside his pulse pounded, emotions coiling tighter and tighter like a vice around his ribs. 15 minutes later, he stood near the garden terrace, hands jammed in his pockets, eyes fixed on the crashing waves below. The rhythmic roar of the ocean did nothing to quiet the chaos inside him. Then, footsteps. He turned. Sienna stood before him, arms crossed, her posture defensive, her expression guarded. Julian exhaled slowly, his voice low and steady despite the fire burning beneath his skin. "Is she mine?" Sienna flinched, just slightly, but he caught it. A hesitation, a flicker of something in her eyes. Then a quiet breath, a pause. And finally, "Yes," she whispered, "she's yours." The world tilted. The weight of those two words slammed into him like a tidal wave. 3 years, 3 years. And he had never known. Julian stood frozen, his mind racing to catch up with reality. But it was like trying to grasp smoke, intangible, slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he tried to make sense of it. Lena was his daughter, his hands curled into fists in his pockets as he forced himself to breathe evenly. But his pulse was wild, erratic, like his heart had just been thrown into unfamiliar territory. Shock, anger, disbelief. But beneath all of it, something deeper, something raw. He had a child. And he had never even known. Sienna shifted, visibly uneasy, bracing herself for whatever storm was coming. "How could you not tell me?" His voice was low, measured, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. She sighed, pressing her fingers against her temple before meeting his gaze head-on. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Julian." A bitter laugh ripped from his throat. "Then how exactly was it supposed to happen?" Sienna exhaled sharply. I never wanted to keep her from you." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something dangerously close to regret. "But by the time I found out I was pregnant, we were already falling apart. You were so consumed with work, so distant. I didn't know how to reach you." Julian's jaw tightened. "So you decided for me." She flinched at the accusation, her eyes darkening. "I thought you'd feel obligated." Her voice was quiet but firm. "That you'd stay out of responsibility, not because you wanted to." She looked away, blinking hard. "I didn't want Lena to grow up feeling like she was a burden." Julian felt something inside him twist, a mix of fury and something else, something he didn't dare name. "So you thought keeping her a secret was the better option?" "I thought I was protecting her," she snapped. "Protecting both of us." Julian ran a hand down his face, trying to keep himself grounded, but the weight of it all was suffocating. She's 3. 3 years of her life? Gone. 3 years he would never get back. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter now, but no less heavy. 3 years, Sienna." Her features softened, and for the first time there was something like remorse in her expression. "I know." The words were barely above a whisper. She swallowed, hesitating. "I won't try to justify it, but I never planned to keep her from you forever." His head snapped up, sharp and unyielding. "Then why didn't you ever reach out?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, exhaling slowly, she met his gaze. "Because I was afraid that if I did, you'd take her from me." Silence. Thick, suffocating. Julian just stared at her, his brain struggling to process the words. "I wouldn't have done that." His voice was rough, tight, forced through clenched teeth. Sienna's expression didn't waver. "Wouldn't you?" And for the first time, Julian wasn't sure of the answer. Julian had spent his entire life making calculated decisions. Every deal, every risk, every carefully planned move had led him to where he was today. He was a man who thrived in control, who dictated the course of every situation. But right now, standing on the edge of uncertainty, he felt something foreign creep into his chest. Doubt. Would he have fought for custody back then? Would he have tried to take over the situation the way he always did? Dominating, controlling, ensuring everything aligned with his terms? He didn't know. Back then, he had been ruthless in his career, relentless in his pursuit of success. Maybe Sienna had been right to keep Lena a secret. Maybe at that time, he hadn't been the kind of man she could trust with something as fragile as a child. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I want to see her." His voice was steady, even as emotions churned inside him. "I want to know my daughter." Sienna searched his face for a long moment, as if she could see straight through him, as if she were trying to determine whether he was saying this because of guilt, because of obligation, or because he truly meant it. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay." The word was soft, hesitant, but it was a beginning. "But we do this on Lena's terms," she continued, her voice firm. "She doesn't know you, Julian. You can't just walk into her life and expect everything to fall into place overnight." He nodded. "I don't expect that." A beat of silence. Then his voice dropped lower, softer, honest. "But I'm not going anywhere this time." For the first time, something in Sienna's expression shifted. The walls she had spent years building weren't gone, not completely. But there was a crack in them now, a small opening. "Then we start slow," she said. "One step at a time." Julian nodded again, his chest tightening with emotions he wasn't entirely sure how to process. For years, he had believed his legacy was the empire he built, the business he had cultivated with his own 2 hands. He had thought his life's purpose was measured in power, in success, in wealth. But standing here now, he realized he had been wrong, and he would do whatever it took to make up for the time he had lost. Julian had never been nervous before. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, stood in boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, and walked into crisis meetings where the wrong move could cost him everything. But as he stood outside the garden terrace, waiting for Sienna to bring Lena, his hands were clenched into fists inside his pockets. "How did you introduce yourself to a daughter who didn't even know you existed?" Sienna had made it clear this would be slow. Julian understood that. He wasn't expecting Lena to run into his arms or call him dad overnight. But the weight of the moment pressed down on him regardless. He had already lost 3 years. He wasn't going to waste another second. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned. Sienna was walking toward him, her posture tense but composed, her dark eyes unreadable. And beside her, clutching her hand tightly, was Lena. Julian's breath caught. She was so small, barely reaching Sienna's waist. Her dark curls bounced slightly as she walked, and those blue eyes, his blue eyes, were wide with quiet curiosity. She clung to her mother's fingers, hesitant, unsure of the new situation she had just been brought into. Sienna knelt beside her daughter, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, this is Julian. He's a friend of mine." Julian felt a sharp sting at the word friend, but he didn't react. He understood why Sienna had said it. Calling him her father outright might have been too overwhelming. Lena looked up at him, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. She didn't say anything at first, just blinked up at him with those impossibly big eyes. Julian crouched down to her level, keeping his movements slow, careful. "Hi, Lena." His voice was gentle, softer than he ever thought he was capable of. "It's really nice to meet you." Lena shifted slightly, her tiny fingers tightening around Sienna's. She glanced up at her mother as if seeking reassurance. Sienna gave a small nod. Only then did Lena finally speak. "Hi." It was just one word, small, uncertain, but it made something inside Julian tighten, like a fist closing around his heart. He smiled, trying to put her at ease. "I heard you like puzzles. Is that true?" Lena's eyes flickered with a spark of interest. She nodded, just barely. Julian exhaled softly, his smile growing. "I'm not very good at them," he admitted, keeping his tone light. "Maybe you could teach me sometime?" Lena's gaze darted to Sienna again, as if checking whether this was okay. And for the first time she didn't look away immediately. For a moment there was only silence. Then Lena nodded, a small, hesitant movement, but it was enough. Julian released a slow breath, realizing only then how tightly he had been holding it in. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sienna reached out, brushing her fingers gently through Lena's curls, her touch instinctively comforting. "Why don't we sit?" she suggested, leading them toward a shaded seating area near the garden. Julian followed, still struggling to grasp the weight of reality. He had a daughter, and she was sitting right in front of him, fidgeting with the hem of her dress, sneaking quick glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Sienna reached into her bag, pulling out a small coloring book and a handful of crayons, placing them in front of Lena. "You can color while we talk, okay?" Lena nodded, flipping open the book and carefully selecting a purple crayon. Julian watched for a moment before speaking, keeping his tone light. "What's your favorite color?" Lena didn't look up, but after a beat, she answered quietly, "Purple." He smiled. "That's a good choice. It's strong." For the first time, Lena met his gaze, not for long, just a fleeting second, but it was enough for Julian to feel a shift inside him. Then, just as quickly, she returned to her coloring. He exhaled slowly, adjusting in his seat. This was going to take time. He had come into this meeting with no expectations, but now that he was sitting here, watching Lena color, the reality of what he had missed was suffocating. Sienna must have noticed the tension creeping into his expression because her voice was soft when she spoke next. "She's shy around new people." Julian nodded. "That's okay. We'll go at her pace." And he meant it. Lena continued coloring, her small fingers gripping the crayon, brows furrowed in concentration. Julian found himself studying her. The way she bit her lip when she focused, the way she curled her fingers slightly as she worked. He had missed so much. Her first steps, her first words, the tiny milestones parents held onto and replayed in their minds for years. But he wouldn't miss anything else. After a few minutes, Lena set down her crayon and looked up at him. "Do you have a favorite color?" Julian's chest tightened at the simple but monumental moment. She was asking him a question. His lips lifted into a small smile. "I think I do now." He glanced at her crayon. "Purple sounds like a good choice." Lena studied him for a second, as if evaluating his answer, then gave a tiny nod, an approval of sorts. Across from him, Sienna watched the exchange, something softening in her expression. And for the first time in years, Julian felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Time had never felt so slow, and yet, at the same time, it was moving too fast. The days following his first meeting with Lena were a delicate balancing act. Each interaction measured, every moment weighted with meaning. Julian had built an empire through calculated decisions, through control, through strategy. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his daughter, and no strategy in the world could make up for lost time. Still, he and Sienna had settled into a fragile, tentative rhythm. Each morning, they met for breakfast at the hotel's restaurant. Julian sat across from Lena as she carefully nibbled on her toast, her movements meticulous. She was still reserved, still watching him, with the quiet curiosity of a child trying to piece together a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But little by little, she let him in. At first, it was small things. A glance in his direction when he spoke, a nod when he asked if she liked strawberries. Then, she started offering him tiny, precious details about her day. How she had seen a funny-looking bird outside the window. How she didn't like the orange juice because it was too sour. And Julian held on to every word. One afternoon, he and Sienna sat on the resort's shaded terrace, sipping coffee while Lena played with a set of small wooden animals at their feet. Julian had been waiting for the right moment. And now, with the soft murmur of the ocean in the background, he finally let himself ask the question that had been haunting him since the moment he saw them. "Why did you come here, Sienna?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on Lena, watching as their daughter arranged the animals into a careful row. And Julian waited, his pulse steady but expectant. Because whatever answer she gave him, it was going to change everything. Sienna watched as Lena carefully stacked small plastic cups into a towering structure, her tiny hands moving with quiet concentration. For a moment, there was only the sound of the ocean breeze and the soft clatter of plastic against the table. "We needed a break," she said at last, her voice quieter than before. "Things at home, they've been hard." Julian studied her, taking in the tension in her shoulders, the slight downturn of her lips. He had known Sienna well enough once to recognize when she was holding something back. "Hard how?" he pressed. Sienna sighed, finally turning to face him fully. "Lena has been asking questions about her father." Something inside Julian twisted, the sharp pang of reality settling deep in his chest. "What did you tell her?" Sienna hesitated, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "At first, I told her that families come in all shapes, that some kids have mommies and daddies together, and some don't." She exhaled slowly. "But she's smart, Julian. She didn't stop asking. She wanted to know if you were out there, if you even knew she existed." Julian clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look down at Lena. She was still focused on her tower, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening just feet away. The thought that she had spent her short life wondering about him, looking for answers that no one gave her, made his chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. "So you brought her here," he murmured. Sienna nodded. "I didn't know if we'd run into you." Her voice was almost hesitant, but I think, part of me hoped we would. Julian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Would you have ever told me?" Sienna swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly against the armrest of her chair. "I don't know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to. I almost did so many times, but I was scared." A part of Julian didn't want to hear her reasons, but another part of him knew he needed to. "Scared of what?" She looked down at her hands, her voice faltering. "That you'd hate me." A breath. That you'd hate her. Her throat bobbed slightly before she admitted, even softer, "Or that you'd try to take her away." Julian stilled. He had spent so much of his life believing that control equaled security. That power meant never being vulnerable. Had he really become the kind of man who Sienna feared would use his influence against her? Had she been right to be afraid? "I would never have done that," he said, his voice steadier than he felt inside. Sienna looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his, as if she was trying to decide whether she could believe him. "I wanted to believe that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many years of silence between them, too many things left unsaid. Then, with a quiet clatter, Lena's carefully built tower collapsed. She let out a small, disappointed sigh. Julian leaned down, carefully picking up the plastic cups and stacking them again. "Want to try again?" Lena hesitated. She looked at him, then at Sienna, as if silently asking for permission. And then she nodded. She reached out, her little fingers brushing against Julian's as she took the cup from his hand. It was a simple moment, a tiny gesture, but to Julian, it meant everything. Sienna watched them, something softening in her expression. Maybe she had been right to be afraid back then. Maybe he hadn't been ready. But he was ready now, and he wasn't going to waste another second. Julian had never been a patient man. His entire life had been built on immediate action, on decisive moves that left no room for hesitation. He was a man who set goals and achieved them, who never let time slip away unnoticed. But now he was realizing that patience was the only thing that would earn him what truly mattered. Lena was beginning to trust him. But it was happening slowly. She still looked to Sienna for reassurance whenever he spoke. She still hesitated before answering his questions. But she was letting him in, little by little. She let him sit beside her at breakfast without inching closer to her mother. She let him help her pick out colors when she was drawing in her sketchbook. She let him hold the door open for her without looking uncertain about whether she should walk through. They were small things, but Julian held on to them as victories. One afternoon, he found himself watching her from across the room as she concentrated on a puzzle, her brows furrowed in focus. And for the first time in his life, Julian Davenport, the man who had spent years chasing success, who had built his empire with relentless ambition, realized something. This was the most important thing he had ever fought for. Julian stood at the edge of the hotel's garden courtyard, watching as Lena crouched near a row of flowers. Her small fingers traced the petals with delicate curiosity, and she murmured something under her breath, too soft for him to hear. A few feet away, Sienna sat on a bench, giving her daughter space but keeping her gaze trained on her with the quiet attentiveness of a mother who was always aware of every little movement. Julian took a slow breath before walking forward, careful not to startle Lena. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Lena glanced up at him briefly before turning back to the flowers. "Talking to the bees." Julian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what are they saying?" She pursed her lips, thinking for a moment. "They're busy, so they don't talk a lot." She tilted her head as if listening. "But I think they like the flowers." Julian crouched down beside her, his gaze following the tiny bees flitting between blossoms. He had never taken the time to notice things like this before. His world had always been fast-paced, ruthless, demanding. But now, sitting here with his daughter, slowing down, didn't seem like such a bad thing. "Do you like flowers?" he asked. Lena nodded. "Mama says they make people happy." Julian glanced toward Sienna, who was watching them but pretending not to listen. He turned back to Lena. "She's right. They do." Lena considered this, then pointed to a small, pale purple flower. "That one's my favorite." Julian smiled. "I remember you said you like purple." Lena's eyes flickered with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to remember something so small. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression softened. Julian didn't push. He let the moment settle between them, quiet but significant. After a while, Lena stood up, dusting off her dress. "I'm hungry." Sienna took that as her cue to stand. "We should go inside. It's almost lunchtime." Julian hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Why don't we eat together?" Sienna looked at Lena, silently asking for her opinion. Lena tilted her head, thinking. Then she nodded. "Okay." It wasn't an enthusiastic yes, but it wasn't a no either. And Julian took that as progress. As they walked inside together, Julian felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. For the first time since learning the truth, he didn't feel like a complete stranger anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was becoming something more. Julian was beginning to understand that trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn, piece by piece, moment by moment. And with Lena, every small victory mattered. Over the next few days, their interactions became more natural. She still had her quiet moments, still hesitated sometimes before speaking to him. But the uncertainty in her eyes, it was fading. She no longer clung to Sienna so tightly when he was near. She no longer kept physical distance between them, as if unsure of his presence. And then, one morning, something unexpected happened. When Julian arrived at the breakfast table, Lena was already seated, a plate of pancakes in front of her. Sienna was pouring herself coffee, looking more relaxed than she had in days. Julian pulled out his chair and sat down, watching as Lena carefully spread syrup over her pancakes, her little brows furrowed in concentration. "Are those any good?" he asked. Lena glanced up at him, chewing thoughtfully before giving a small nod. "They're okay." Julian smirked. "Just okay?" She considered this for a moment. Then, with complete seriousness, she said, "They'd be better with strawberries." Julian nodded, matching her tone. "I'll remember that next time." Lena studied him, as if trying to decide whether he really meant it. Then, without saying anything, she pushed her plate slightly toward him. "You can have some if you want." Julian felt something tighten in his chest. It was such a simple gesture, but, coming from her, it meant everything. Julian picked up his fork, cutting a small piece of pancake before taking a bite. "Not bad," he said thoughtfully, "but I think you're right. Strawberries would make them better." Lena gave a small, pleased smile before returning to her breakfast. Across the table, Sienna had been watching the exchange quietly, a knowing look in her eyes. It was the first time Lena had willingly shared something with him, and they both knew it. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk along the beach. The resort's private shoreline was peaceful, the waves lapping gently against the sand. Lena walked between them, her small hand occasionally reaching for Sienna's as they strolled. Julian watched as she bent down to pick up a seashell, turning it over in her hands before holding it up. "This one's pretty." Julian took it from her, inspecting it with care. "It is. Do you like collecting shells?" Lena nodded. "Mama says they're like little memories from the ocean." Julian handed the shell back to her. "Then you should keep it." She hesitated for just a second before slipping it into the pocket of her dress. And then, in a move that completely caught him off guard, she reached out and took his hand. It was just a fleeting touch, her small fingers wrapping around his for a brief moment before she let go and ran ahead, laughing as the water splashed near her feet. Julian stood there, frozen, feeling something shift deep inside him. Beside him, Sienna smiled softly. "She's getting used to you." Julian let out a slow breath, his eyes still on Lena as she twirled along the shoreline. "I think I'm getting used to her too," he admitted. And for the first time in his life, business, power, and success didn't seem like the most important things in the world. She did. Julian had spent his entire life believing that success was measured in numbers, profits, acquisitions, market shares. Those were the things he had built his world around. But standing on the beach, watching Lena pick up seashells with pure delight in her eyes, he realized maybe he had been wrong all along. The rest of the afternoon passed in a way that felt almost surreal. They walked along the shore, Lena running ahead every few minutes to chase the waves before sprinting back to show Julian another treasure she had found buried in the sand. And each time she looked up at him, there was a little more trust in her eyes, as if she was slowly beginning to believe that he wasn't going anywhere. By the time the sun began to set, they had gathered a small pile of seashells, which Lena carefully arranged on the wooden deck near the beach chairs. She sat cross-legged, inspecting each one before sorting them into groups. Julian watched, fascinated by the way she focused so intently on something so simple. Sienna sat beside him, a warm breeze lifting strands of her dark hair as she glanced between them. "She's never had this before," she said softly. Julian turned to her, brow furrowing. "Had what?" Sienna hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "A father figure. Someone who's present. Someone who looks at her the way you do." Julian swallowed hard, unsure how to respond to that. He had spent years convincing himself that family wasn't something he needed, that love and relationships were distractions, things that would only slow him down. But looking at Lena now, he ached for all the moments he had missed. "I can't change the past," he finally said, his voice quieter. "But I can be here now, if you'll let me." Sienna looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "And what happens when we leave this place?" Julian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had been thinking about that too. Time at the resort had felt like a world apart, a quiet escape where reality had been put on pause. But now, as the trip neared its end, Julian realized something with absolute certainty. He didn't want this to be temporary. As they stood near the reception desk, waiting to check out, he turned to Sienna. "I don't want this to end when we leave," he said, voice steady but laced with something deeper, something vulnerable. "I want to be in her life, not just for a few days, not just as some distant figure she barely knows. I want to be her father, really be there for her." Sienna studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "That means showing up, Julian," she said at last. "Not just when it's convenient. Not just when it fits into your schedule. She's not a business deal you can negotiate. She's a little girl who needs stability, who needs to know that the people in her life won't just walk away. Julian nodded, his jaw tightening. I know that, he said, and I want to prove to you that I can do this, that I can be what she needs. Sienna didn't answer right away. She searched his face, and for the first time he saw the last traces of her hesitation begin to fade. Then prove it, she whispered. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted them. Look. Lena ran up to them, her tiny hands cupped around something. She opened her fingers, revealing a small, perfectly shaped white seashell. This one is special, she announced. Julian leaned down, taking the delicate shell from her palm. It's beautiful, he said. Why is it special? Lena tilted her head, thinking for a second before answering. Because it's the last one I found today. It's like a lucky shell. Julian smiled, his chest tightening at the simple innocence in her words. Then I think we should keep it, he said softly. As a reminder. Lena nodded eagerly. Then, without hesitation, she climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. Julian felt his breath catch. It was the first time she had come to him on her own, without prompting, without Sienna's reassurance. It was a silent gesture, but it meant everything. He looked up at Sienna, and in her expression he saw something shift. Something that looked a lot like acceptance. For the first time in his life, Julian Sterling had found something truly worth holding on to. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. This isn't a story of grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It's a story of something far more meaningful. Commitment, trust, and the slow rebuilding of relationships. Julian begins his journey believing that success is about control, about power, about keeping emotions at a distance. But by the end, he learns that real success isn't measured in wealth or boardroom victories. It's measured in the quiet moments of connection, in the trust of a child, in the love that grows when you least expect it. Lena's acceptance doesn't come all at once, and that's what makes it feel real. It happens in small moments, allowing him to sit beside her at breakfast, sharing her pancakes, reaching for his hand without hesitation. But the most when she climbs onto his lap, resting against him. It's unspoken. No words, no formal declarations. Just the quiet belief that he is someone she can rely on. And Sienna, she isn't just a love interest. She's a mother first. Her hesitation isn't about punishing Julian. It's about protecting her child. She needs to see that he isn't just making empty promises, that he won't walk away when things get difficult. When she tells him to prove it, she isn't making the decision for him. She's giving him the chance to make it himself. And that's what makes this ending so satisfying. Julian doesn't fix everything overnight. The story doesn't end with a perfect, wrapped-up resolution. Instead, it ends with a promise that this time he'll stay. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Julian watched Lena run ahead, her laughter carried by the salty breeze. He had spent years thinking he had everything: power, success, control. But here, in the quiet of the evening, he realized he had been missing the most important thing all along. Family. Not just in name, not just in obligation, but in presence, in love, in the simple act of showing up. Sienna stood beside him, her arms crossed as she watched their daughter chase the waves. There was no more hesitation in her stance, no more guarded walls. For the first time, she seemed to believe in the possibility of something new. Julian turned to her. I meant what I said, he murmured. I'm not walking away. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. Then prove it. This time, he didn't argue. He simply would. Because this wasn't about grand gestures or trying to rewrite the past. This was about earning the future. This isn't a fairy tale. It doesn't end with a perfect, unrealistic happily ever after. Instead, it ends with something far more meaningful. A father learning what it means to truly be there, a mother learning to trust again, and a little girl learning that love isn't something that disappears when things get hard. This is a story about making up for lost time. A story about the realization that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stay. And in the end, Julian doesn't just find his daughter. He finds something even more valuable. A purpose that no amount of money, power, or success could ever replace. Stories like these remind us that life is full of unexpected turns, that love and family aren't just about where we come from, but about the choices we make every day. We hope this story touched your heart, made you reflect, and perhaps even inspired you in some way. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another heartfelt tale. And remember, it's never too late for second chances, for healing, and for finding what truly matters. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.